friends, neighbors, patriots, the future of this great union.
He was America's first president, born as a U.S. citizen. He rose from his father's tavern in a small Dutch village to lead the most powerful nation on earth. But his presidency became the most catastrophic failure in American political history. Within 48 hours of taking office, the economy collapsed, banks failed, businesses closed, millions of Americans lost everything. And Martin Van Buren watched it all happen, refusing to act. This is the story of how a political genius became a total failure. This is the story of Martin Van Buren, a man whose life teaches us that winning isn't everything, that power without purpose is hollow, and that sometimes our greatest achievements become our deepest regrets. Kinderhook, New York, December 5, 1782. The Revolutionary War was still raging when Martin Van Buren entered the world above his father's tavern. The air smelled of beer and pipe smoke. Soldiers marched through muddy streets. The future of America was uncertain. But in this chaos, a boy was born who would reshape American politics forever. His father, Martin Van Buren, was a tavern keeper and later a slave owner. His mother, Maria, was quiet and strong. Martin was the third of 5 children in a Dutch family that had been in America for over a century. They were not wealthy. They were not connected to the powerful families that dominated American politics. They were ordinary people in an ordinary village on the Hudson River. But Martin was different from his brothers. While other boys played in the streets, Martin worked in his father's tavern, listening intently to every conversation. Merchants complained about taxes and trade policies. Lawyers discussed court cases and legal principles. Politicians plotted strategies and made backroom deals. Young Martin stood behind the bar, cleaning glasses and refilling mugs, and filled his mind with knowledge about power, politics, and human nature. The tavern became his classroom. The patrons became his professors. He was receiving an education that no school could provide. Here's what's shocking about Van Buren. He never went to college. While other future presidents were sitting in classrooms at Harvard or Yale, studying Latin and Greek, Van Buren was working in his father's tavern, listening to real conversations about real power. He was absorbing practical knowledge about how the world actually worked. While his future competitors were reading theory, Van Buren was learning practice. While they were memorizing ancient philosophers, Van Buren was watching how ordinary people made decisions and influenced one another. He discovered something that most educated men never understand, that power isn't about what you know from books. It's about understanding what people want and how to give it to them. At 14 years old, Martin Van Buren began working as a clerk in the law office of Francis Sylvester, a prominent attorney in Kinderhook. This was his real education. He learned the language of the law. He learned the structure of contracts. He learned the power of words written on paper. He discovered that the law was the key to power in America. While other boys his age were thinking about farming or trade or inheriting family businesses, Van Buren was studying law books by candlelight, teaching himself the skills that would become his greatest weapon in life. He learned to read contracts carefully, understanding that every word mattered. He learned to write precisely, knowing that vague language could destroy your case. He learned to think logically and systematically about problems. He learned to see situations from multiple perspectives, to understand his opponent's arguments before they made them. He learned to find weaknesses in legal positions and to exploit them. He learned to build arguments that were logically airtight and emotionally compelling. By the time he turned 21, Van Buren had completed his legal training and was admitted to the bar. He was now a lawyer in a new nation that desperately needed men who understood the law. The United States was barely holding together. The Articles of Confederation had failed just a few years before. The Constitution was brand new, ratified just 3 years before Van Buren became a lawyer. Everything was uncertain. Everything was possible. Van Buren sensed it. He opened a law practice in Kinderhook and began taking cases. He was competent, he was smart, he was thorough. He won cases that other lawyers thought were unwinnable. His reputation grew. People began to come to him, not just from Kinderhook, but from neighboring towns. He became known as a lawyer who understood his opponents, who anticipated their arguments, who found creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Here's what separates Van Buren from the other early American politicians. He had absolutely nothing except talent. While Thomas Jefferson owned thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves, Van Buren owned almost nothing. While John Adams had family connections that reached into the halls of Massachusetts politics, Van Buren had only his own ability to rely on. While many future presidents came from wealthy merchant families, Van Buren came from a tavern keeper's family. This should have limited him. Without wealth or family connections, Van Buren should have remained a small-town lawyer for his entire life. Instead, it liberated him. With nothing to lose, Van Buren could take risks. He could learn, he could grow. He could become something greater than his circumstances suggested, and he did. In 1807, at 24 years old, Van Buren married Hannah Hose, a cousin from a local Dutch family. She came from respectable stock. The marriage was considered a good match by the standards of the time. They had 4 sons together: Abraham, John, Martin Jr., and Smith. Hannah died in 1819 at the age of 35, leaving Van Buren a widower with 4 boys to raise. He never remarried. This was unusual for a man in his position. Most powerful men would have quickly taken another wife to manage their household and advance their political connections. Van Buren didn't. For the rest of his life, he was a widower, and some historians suggest that this may have affected him, creating a kind of emotional distance that would impact his relationships throughout his life. Van Buren's path to power was methodical and relentless. In 1812, at age 30, he was elected to the New York State Senate. 7 years later, in 1819, he became the Attorney General of New York. 10 years after that, in 1829, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Each step was calculated, each position built upon the last. He was like a chess player, always thinking 5 moves ahead, always positioning himself for the next advancement. As a senator, Van Buren caught the attention of powerful men who saw in him a useful tool. He was smart, he was organized, and most importantly, he was pragmatic. He didn't waste time on ideological battles that couldn't be won. He made deals. He found common ground. He built coalitions. This made him invaluable to politicians who wanted to actually accomplish things in Washington. Politicians started calling him the magician. Not because he performed tricks, but because he had an almost supernatural ability to make complex political situations disappear. A conflict between 2 powerful senators. Van Buren would find a compromise that satisfied both. A party threatening to splinter over an issue. Van Buren would reframe the debate so that unity seemed like victory. A political crisis that seemed unsolvable. Van Buren would find a path forward that nobody else had seen. He didn't win arguments by being the loudest voice in the room. He didn't win by being the smartest man present. He won them by understanding how people thought, what motivated them, what they feared, what they wanted. He moved people like a conductor moves an orchestra. He understood that politics is not about truth or justice or ideology. Politics is about interests and power. Once you understand what people's interests are, you can move them. This skill would serve him well for years, but it would eventually betray him. In 1821, Van Buren was elected to the House of Representatives. It was a smaller stage than the Senate, and some saw it as a step backward. But Van Buren saw it as an opportunity. The House was where power was actually exercised. The Senate was where ambitious men made speeches. In the House, Van Buren could build relationships with ordinary congressmen, the workhorses of American politics. That same year, something remarkable happened in American politics. Andrew Jackson, a military hero from Tennessee who had never held political office, emerged as a powerful political force. Jackson represented something new in American politics. A man of action rather than education. A man of the frontier rather than the cities. A man who spoke plainly rather than in the flowery language of the educated elite. Jackson promised to fight for the common man against the elites who had controlled American politics. Van Buren recognized immediately what Jackson represented: the future. While other politicians dismissed Jackson as an unsophisticated military man, Van Buren understood that the American people were tired of the old guard. They wanted someone who seemed like one of them. They wanted someone who spoke their language. Van Buren did something extraordinary. He attached himself to Jackson and became the chief architect of what would become the Democratic Party. He traveled to every state, met with local leaders, built alliances, and created a machine that could move voters. He forged fragmented political movements that supported Jackson into an organized, disciplined political force. He invented the political machine. The Albany Regency, as it became known, was revolutionary in its organization. Van Buren appointed party members to every office he could control. He used the patronage system to reward loyal supporters with government jobs. He published newspapers that spread his political message. He organized supporters into blocks of voters who could be counted on election day. It was modern politics created in the early 1800s, decades before American politics became as organized as it would eventually be. But something unexpected happened. Jackson began to trust Van Buren more than he trusted almost anyone else in his life. The president and the secretary became close allies and genuine friends, which was rare in American politics. Jackson's first vice president was John C. Calhoun, a powerful politician from South Carolina. Calhoun represented the old guard of politics: wealthy, connected, and stubborn. As Jackson's presidency progressed, conflict between Jackson and Calhoun grew more intense. The two men represented different visions of America, and they couldn't coexist in the same administration. Van Buren was positioned as the alternative. When Calhoun fell from favor with Jackson, Van Buren was waiting. In 1832, at 50 years old, Martin Van Buren became Vice President of the United States. The orphan from a small Dutch village on the Hudson River was now one of the two most powerful men in America. He had climbed higher than anyone could have predicted when that poor tavern-keeper's son was born 80 years earlier. The 1836 election should have been straightforward. Van Buren was Jackson's right hand. The Democratic Party had to choose a new candidate. It should have been Van Buren, and it was. But nothing about the succession was automatic. Van Buren had to actually win the election. The opposition Whig Party ran multiple candidates, hoping to split the electoral votes and force the election into the House of Representatives, where they might have a better chance of prevailing. But Van Buren's machine held firm. He won the election convincingly and became the 8th President of the United States. On March 4, 1837, Martin Van Buren was inaugurated as president. He stood on the Capitol steps with his hand on the Bible. He took the oath of office. He became the most powerful man in America. He had achieved his life's goal. He had reached the highest position in the nation. For a man who had started with nothing, this was the ultimate triumph. This was the moment that all his years of work had been building toward. 48 hours later, the American economy collapsed. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst financial crises in American history. Within days, banks failed by the hundreds. Businesses shut down. People lost their life savings. Unemployment skyrocketed. Factory workers couldn't find jobs. Farmers couldn't sell their crops. The nation spiraled into depression that would last for years. Breadlines formed in cities. Families became homeless. Starvation became a real possibility for millions of Americans. And it happened on Van Buren's watch. His first day as president, everything fell apart. It was as if the moment he took office, fate itself conspired against him. The political machine that had brought him to power couldn't protect him from economic forces beyond his control. Historians have documented that the Panic of 1837 was not Van Buren's fault. The economic conditions that caused it had been building for years, during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Many historians argue that Jackson's financial policies actually contributed to the crash. Van Buren inherited a broken system and had the bad luck to be president when it finally shattered. But luck doesn't matter to voters. Voters don't care about economic theory or historical causation. Voters care about their ability to feed their families. They care about having jobs. They care about keeping their homes. They care about their president doing something to help them. Van Buren did nothing. He believed in limited government. He believed that the economy should sort itself out naturally. He believed that government intervention would only make things worse. He vetoed bills that would have provided relief to suffering Americans. He refused to use federal funds to help the desperate. He maintained that the best policy was to do nothing and let time heal the wounds. This philosophy had some logical consistency. Van Buren wasn't cruel or heartless. He genuinely believed that free markets would eventually restore prosperity. He thought that government programs would create dependence and weaken people's character. He was convinced that his refusal to act was actually the moral position. But he was catastrophically wrong about how people think during a crisis. When people are starving, they don't want to hear about economic theory. They want to know that their president cares about their suffering. They want to see their leader taking action. They want to believe that somebody in power is fighting for them. Van Buren's refusal to act became the defining feature of his presidency. People called him heartless. They said he didn't care about ordinary Americans. The newspapers mocked him mercilessly. Political opponents painted him as an elitist who cared more about abstract principles than about human suffering. The Whig Party, sensing Van Buren's weakness, made him their target. They created a memorable campaign narrative. Van Buren was an aristocrat who lived in luxury while ordinary Americans suffered. They pointed to his fine clothes and his sophisticated tastes as evidence that he was out of touch with common people. They called him Martin Van Ruin. The nickname stuck. Here's what's deeply ironic. Van Buren actually came from poverty and humble origins. His father was a tavern keeper. He had worked his way up through pure talent and hard work. He had no inherited wealth and no family connections. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream. A man who rose from nothing to become president. But the Whigs didn't care about facts. They cared about narrative, and they had created a narrative that Americans believed that Van Buren was an elitist, a snob, a man who didn't care about ordinary people. The truth didn't matter. The perception became the reality. Van Buren couldn't convince people otherwise because his refusal to act seemed to confirm their suspicions. Van Buren served one term as president, from 1837 to 1841. During those 4 years, he continued to be paralyzed by his belief in limited government, while the nation sank deeper into depression. He lost supporters. The Democratic Party began to abandon him. Political leaders who had been loyal to him suddenly distanced themselves. By the time 1840 came around, he was finished. The 1840 election was a disaster for Van Buren. The opposition Whig Party ran William Henry Harrison, a military hero, as their candidate. Harrison was everything Van Buren wasn't: popular, charismatic, and a figure of national acclaim. In a country suffering from economic depression, voters wanted change. They wanted a leader who would do something. They voted Van Buren out of office by a massive margin. He lost by the largest electoral defeat of any incumbent president up to that point. He had achieved his dream of becoming president, only to discover that his presidency was a disaster. After losing the presidency, Van Buren returned to Kinderhook, the small Dutch village where he had been born. He was 58 years old, and his political career seemed to be over. He had reached the highest office in the land and failed. The newspapers had turned against him. His own party had abandoned him. He was a political pariah, a man who had achieved everything and lost it all. But Van Buren wasn't done yet. Like many American politicians before and after him, he couldn't accept defeat. He tried to make a comeback. In 1844, Van Buren tried to regain the presidency. He was now in his 60s, and the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The great issue of the time was whether the United States should annex Texas. Van Buren opposed annexation because he believed it would strengthen the slave states and upset the balance of power between North and South. This position was, in retrospect, correct. Van Buren understood that slavery was the central issue tearing America apart. He believed that admitting Texas as a slave state would intensify the conflict and push the nation toward catastrophe. He was absolutely right. He had warned people that compromise was impossible. He had said that slavery could not be managed through political deals. He had predicted that the nation would eventually face a terrible conflict if the slavery question wasn't resolved. But in 1844, his position made him unelectable. The Democratic Party, desperate to win, chose James K. Polk as their candidate instead. Polk supported annexation. Van Buren lost the nomination. Polk won the election and went on to annex Texas, start a war with Mexico, and set in motion the events that would lead directly to the Civil War. Van Buren had warned them. They didn't listen. And history proved him right, though the vindication came at a terrible cost. By this point, Van Buren had shifted his political ideology fundamentally. He was moving away from the Democratic Party toward the anti-slavery movement. In 1848, he became the presidential candidate of the Free Soil Party, a new political movement dedicated to preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories. It was a symbolic campaign. Van Buren knew he couldn't win, but he wanted to make a statement about the importance of stopping slavery. He received about 10% of the popular vote, not enough to win, but enough to split the Democratic vote and ensure that Zachary Taylor, a Whig, became president instead. Van Buren's political career had circled back to where it started. He was using politics to make a point rather than to actually gain power. Except this time, he was making a moral point. He was willing to sacrifice his own political interests for principle. He was willing to lose the presidency for the second time in order to take a stand against slavery. In his 60s and 70s, Van Buren reinvented himself once again. He became an advocate for anti-slavery politics. He wrote political treatises defending his positions. He gave speeches opposing slavery. He supported the Free Soil movement. He was, in many ways, more radical in his later years than he had ever been in his earlier years when he held actual political power. This is one of the great ironies of Van Buren's life. He had more political courage in his old age, when he had nothing left to lose, than he had during his years in power, when he had everything to lose. Van Buren purchased a large estate called Lindenwold in Kinderhook, near where he had been born. This estate became his home for the final decades of his life. It was a comfortable, prosperous estate, with beautiful grounds and a large house. It was the kind of place where a wealthy man could live quietly and reflect on his life. Van Buren filled Lindenwold with books and with visitors who wanted to meet the former president. He held court like an elder statesman, receiving visitors who wanted to discuss politics or history or philosophy. In his library at Lindenwold, Van Buren spent countless hours reading and reflecting. He read history books to understand the patterns of the past. He read philosophy to try to make sense of his own life. He read literature for pleasure and escape. His library was where he thought through his ideas and tried to understand the events he had lived through. He wrote his memoirs. He wrote political essays. He reflected on his life and his times. He tried to explain his actions to history. One area where Van Buren's legacy is undeniable is in creating the modern political party system. Before Van Buren, American politics was dominated by personal factions and family networks. After Van Buren, it was dominated by organized political parties with clear structures and mechanisms for choosing candidates and running campaigns. Van Buren essentially invented the political machine that would dominate American politics for more than a century. He understood that in a democratic system, you need organization to compete. You need loyal followers who can be relied upon to work for your candidates. You need a party structure that can move quickly and efficiently. You need to be able to mobilize voters on election day. You need to be able to handle money and distribute resources effectively. You need to be able to communicate your message consistently across many different regions and populations. He created the template for how American political parties would operate. Every political machine that came after his was influenced by the structures and mechanisms that Van Buren pioneered. The Democratic Party that emerged from Van Buren's work became one of the two dominant parties in American politics. It would produce many presidents and would shape American history for generations. Modern historians recognize that Van Buren's creation of the Democratic Party and the political machine was enormously important. They recognize that modern American politics cannot be understood without understanding what Van Buren did. They recognize that he deserves to be studied seriously, even if he is not remembered by the general public. How do we measure whether a person is great? Is greatness determined by how much you accomplish? Is it determined by how much influence you have? Is it determined by whether you achieve your goals? Or is greatness determined by moral clarity, sacrifice, and vision? Van Buren is not considered a great president. He's considered a failed president. He didn't accomplish much in office. He faced a crisis and failed to respond effectively. He was removed from office after one term. He left office unpopular and widely regarded as a failure. But Van Buren did accomplish things in other areas of his life. He built a political party that lasted for more than a century and a half. He created political innovations that shaped American politics. He demonstrated that men without inherited wealth or family connections could achieve the highest office in the land. He showed that ordinary men could rise to extraordinary heights through talent and hard work. Are these accomplishments enough to make him great? Or do they only make him important, but not great? Different people will answer this question differently. Some will say that his political innovations are profound enough to make him great, regardless of his failed presidency. Others will say that a failed presidency is disqualifying, that no political innovations can make up for failing to lead the nation during a crisis. Van Buren's life teaches us that there's a difference between being important and being great. Van Buren was important. He shaped American history. His influence is still felt today. But Van Buren was not great. A great president would have responded to the crisis. A great leader would have inspired the nation. A great man would have found the courage to take a stand on slavery earlier in his career. Here's another key question. How much responsibility does Van Buren bear for the Panic of 1837? Was it his fault? Did he cause it? Modern historians have generally concluded that Van Buren did not cause the Panic of 1837. The economic conditions that led to the panic had been developing for years during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Many historians argue that Jackson's financial policies actually contributed to the crash. Van Buren inherited a broken system and had the bad luck to be president when the system finally collapsed. But the question of whether Van Buren caused the panic is less important than the question of how he responded to it. Even if Van Buren wasn't responsible for causing the panic, he was responsible for his response to it. And his response was inadequate. He refused to act. He clung to ideology while people suffered. That is Van Buren's responsibility. Van Buren's failure as president has important lessons for contemporary politics. In our own time, we have politicians who are skilled at organization and machinery, but who lack vision and leadership ability. We have politicians who are focused on winning elections rather than on accomplishing anything once elections have been won. We have a political system that seems focused on political machinery rather than on actual leadership. Van Buren's failure is a warning to modern politicians. If you make the same choices that Van Buren made, if you prioritize political machinery over vision, pragmatism over principle, winning elections over leadership, then you will suffer the same failures that Van Buren suffered. You will find yourself president during a crisis, and you will discover that all your political skill is useless if you don't know what to do with power. Martin Van Buren died on July 24, 1862, at the age of 79. He had lived to see the beginning of the Civil War. He had lived to see the nation that he had tried to hold together tearing itself apart. He had lived long enough to see slavery become the central issue of American politics. He had lived long enough to see his compromises proven wrong by history. He had lived long enough to see the conflict that he had warned against become inevitable. Van Buren lived a long life, and he spent a large portion of that life watching his choices be proven wrong by history. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of his life. Not that he failed, but that he lived long enough to know he had failed. The historical judgment of Van Buren has evolved over time. In his own era, he was widely condemned as a failure and a weakling. Newspapers mocked him. Political opponents attacked him relentlessly. He became a symbol of ineffectual leadership. But in the late 20th century, historians began to look at Van Buren more seriously. They recognized his importance in creating the Democratic Party and the political machine. They began to understand his role in shaping American politics. Academic historians wrote substantial works about him. He began to be studied as an important figure in American political development. But this academic reassessment has not changed his popular reputation. Most Americans still don't know who Van Buren was. Most Americans don't recognize his importance. In popular historical rankings, Van Buren still ranks near the bottom of presidents. His academic rehabilitation has not translated into popular recognition. Van Buren's life teaches several lessons that remain profoundly relevant to our contemporary times. First, it teaches about the fundamental difference between political skill and leadership ability. Van Buren was one of the greatest political operators America has ever produced. He understood how to build organizations. He understood how to move people and money and influence. He could accomplish almost anything in the realm of politics. He could build coalitions between different groups. He could manage factional conflicts within his party. He could organize supporters across multiple states. He was brilliant at the mechanics of politics. But political skill is not the same as leadership ability. When Van Buren became president, all of his political skill proved useless. He knew how to win elections and maintain power, but he didn't know how to inspire people or lead them through crisis. He didn't know how to communicate vision. He didn't know how to make people believe in him. He didn't know how to take decisive action when circumstances demanded it. In fact, his refusal to act during the Depression was an expression of his political character. He preferred to maintain his principles and consistency rather than adapt to changed circumstances and respond to genuine human suffering. Van Buren's life teaches about the limits of pragmatism in politics. Van Buren was the ultimate pragmatist. He believed in compromise. He believed in finding middle ground. He believed in working within the system to accomplish goals. He didn't care much for ideological battles or moral crusades. He cared about practical results. He cared about what was possible rather than what was right. This pragmatic approach worked well for most of Van Buren's career. It allowed him to build coalitions and accomplish things. But when he became president, pragmatism failed him completely. He faced a crisis that could not be solved by compromise. He faced an economic collapse that required bold action and innovative thinking. His pragmatic refusal to act made things worse, not better. His refusal to use government power to help people actually deepened the crisis and turned public opinion against him. There are situations in life and in politics where pragmatism is not enough. Sometimes moral clarity is required. Sometimes bold action is required. Sometimes you have to risk failure for the possibility of success. Van Buren didn't understand this, and it cost him his presidency and his legacy. The challenge for contemporary leaders is to find the right balance between pragmatism and principle. To be pragmatic about means while being principled about ends. To be willing to compromise on tactics while remaining clear about values. Van Buren failed to find this balance. He became so pragmatic that he lost sight of principle entirely. He compromised with slavery when slavery should not have been compromised with. He chose inaction during the Depression when action was desperately needed. Van Buren's life teaches us that vision is essential for leadership. Van Buren had organizational genius but no vision. He could tell you how to build a political machine, but he couldn't tell you what that machine was for. He could win elections, but he couldn't lead once he was elected. He could describe the mechanics of building a political party, but he couldn't articulate the purpose of that party. Modern leaders need to understand that vision is not optional. Vision is essential. People need to know what you believe. People need to understand what you are trying to accomplish. People need to see the world as you want them to see it. People need to believe that you have a purpose beyond simply gaining and maintaining power. Van Buren couldn't do this. He was a technician, not a visionary. He was skilled at the machinery of politics, but he had nothing to say about what America should be or become. He had no vision of the future. He had no compelling narrative about what America could become. He had only the machinery, and machinery alone is not enough to inspire people or lead them through difficult times. Here's what is most tragic about Van Buren's presidency. He had an opportunity that few people get. He had built a political party. He had demonstrated his ability to organize. He had proven his loyalty and his competence. When he became president, he had enormous goodwill. The nation was willing to follow his lead. If he had chosen to act boldly, if he had proposed major government relief programs, if he had used the presidency not as a machine to exercise power but as a platform to inspire people, he might have been remembered as a great president. Instead, he chose to do nothing. He chose to maintain his principles and his ideology in the face of human suffering. Because of this choice, he is remembered as a failure. It's not clear whether Van Buren ever fully understood the magnitude of what he lost. He lived long enough to see that his presidency was a failure, but he may not have understood how close he came to being remembered as a great president if he had made different choices. Van Buren's life teaches us that what you accomplish during your time in power is not necessarily what determines your legacy. Van Buren accomplished very little as president. He faced a crisis and did nothing. His presidency is widely regarded as a failure. But Van Buren's legacy is not simply the sum of what he accomplished as president. His legacy also includes what he did before and after his presidency. He built the Democratic Party. He created the political machine. He was an important figure in American politics for more than 50 years. He helped shape the way American politics works. He demonstrated that ordinary men without inherited wealth could achieve the highest office. These accomplishments are part of his legacy. The final lesson from Van Buren's life is that failure is not the end. Van Buren failed as a president. He faced a crisis and was unable to respond effectively. His failure was public and unmistakable. He was removed from office after one term, rejected by the voters and by his own party. But Van Buren's failure did not destroy him. He lived for more than 20 years after his presidency ended. He wrote, he reflected, he reinvented himself. He continued to be politically active. He gradually reframed his life in a way that gave it meaning, even though his presidency had been a failure. What Van Buren discovered is that failure is not the end of your life. Failure is a chapter in your story, not the entire story. The question is not whether you fail, but what you do after you fail. Do you give up? Do you become bitter? Do you try to explain away your failure? Or do you accept your failure and try to move forward? In the end, Martin Van Buren teaches us something profound about the human condition and about American history. He teaches us that ambition alone is not enough. He teaches us that achievement without purpose is hollow. He teaches us that power without vision is meaningless. He teaches us that winning isn't everything. That sometimes you can achieve your greatest goal and discover that it brings you no satisfaction. Van Buren spent his entire life pursuing power. He succeeded beyond almost anyone's expectations. He became president. He achieved the highest office in the land. But when he finally achieved the greatest prize, it turned to ashes in his hands. He faced a crisis and was unable to respond. He was removed from office. He lived the remainder of his life, knowing that his presidency would be remembered as a failure. He lived long enough to see history prove him wrong on slavery. He lived long enough to see the nation descend into the civil war that he had warned against. The tragedy of Van Buren is not that he failed, but that he succeeded in achieving the wrong goal. He spent his entire life pursuing power. He succeeded in getting power. And then he discovered that power was not what he really wanted. Or, more precisely, that he didn't know what to do with the power once he had it. This is the essence of tragedy in the classical sense. Not that you fail to achieve your goals, but that you achieve them and discover that the goals were not worth pursuing. Van Buren is a tragic figure because he achieved his dream and found it to be empty. Although Van Buren is not well known to most Americans today, His legacy is everywhere. Every time American voters go to the polls to vote for a candidate endorsed by a political party, they are participating in a system that Van Buren helped create. Every time a political party holds a convention to nominate a candidate, they are using a mechanism that traces its lineage back to Van Buren's innovations. Every time politicians organize supporters to work for a candidate, they are using techniques that Van Buren pioneered. Every time a campaign distributes resources strategically across multiple states, that strategy reflects principles that Van Buren discovered. Van Buren's influence on American political practice is so deep and so pervasive that most people are not even aware that it comes from Van Buren. His innovations became so normal, so standard, so expected, that people forgot where they came from. But they came from Van Buren. His fingerprints are all over modern American politics. The Democratic Party that still exists today is, in many ways, still structured according to principles that Van Buren established in the 1820s and 1830s. In this way, Van Buren achieved a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of fame. Not the immortality of being remembered, but the immortality of having made a difference that continues to matter, even if most people don't know that the difference came from him. His creations will outlast the memory of his name. His innovations will continue to shape how politics is conducted. His machines will continue to move voters and influence elections. When we stand back and look at Van Buren's entire life, what emerges is the portrait of a man who lived through one of the most transformative periods in American history. He was born in 1782, just as the American Revolution was concluding and the new nation was beginning to figure out how to govern itself. He died in 1862. As the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery, and as a new America was emerging from the ashes of the old, Van Buren witnessed the implementation of the Constitution. He witnessed the Louisiana Purchase and the expansion of American territory westward. He witnessed the War of 1812 and the burning of Washington. He witnessed the rise of the common man in American politics. He witnessed the beginning of the sectional crisis that would eventually destroy the Union. He was not merely a witness to these great events, he was a participant. He helped shape events. He made decisions that influenced the course of history. One of the most difficult things about studying Van Buren is that he resists easy judgment. He was not simply a good man or a bad man. He was not simply a success or a failure. He was a complex human being who made both wise decisions and foolish ones, who achieved great things and failed at important tasks, who was both admirable and contemptible in different ways. This complexity is uncomfortable. We want history to be clear. We want to know who was good and who was bad. We want to know who was right and who was wrong. But Van Buren's life doesn't give us this clarity. Instead, it gives us nuance. It gives us ambiguity. It gives us a figure who cannot be simply categorized or judged. Van Buren's life is a mirror in which we can see ourselves. We can see our own ambitions reflected in his ambitions. We can see our own compromises reflected in his compromises. We can see our own failures reflected in his failures. We can see our own attempts to balance principle and pragmatism reflected in his attempts. And the message that Van Buren sends to us across the centuries is this: be careful what you pursue. Be careful what you're willing to sacrifice to achieve your goals. Be careful that you don't sacrifice so much that you end up with nothing. Be careful that you don't achieve your goals only to discover that they were not worth pursuing. Van Buren pursued power. He achieved power. And then he discovered that power without vision, power without principle, power without purpose, is ultimately hollow. This is the message that Van Buren sends to us. This is what his life teaches us about the human condition. This is what makes his story worth telling and worth studying, even more than 150 years after his death. As we face the challenges of our own time in the 21st century, Van Buren's life becomes newly relevant in ways that perhaps he never anticipated. We face economic challenges that require government action. We face moral challenges regarding justice and equality that require clear moral stands. We face political challenges in maintaining democratic institutions that require leadership and vision. Van Buren's failure in all three of these areas teaches us something important. That skill in politics is not sufficient. That you cannot win elections and then do nothing. That you cannot maintain political power by refusing to act on the important questions of your time. That sooner or later, the bill comes due. Sooner or later, the world changes in a way that your political machinery cannot handle. Sooner or later, people demand that their leaders actually lead. In our contemporary age, we see politicians who remind us of Van Buren in troubling ways. We see politicians who are skilled at winning elections, but who have no vision for what they want to accomplish once they are elected. We see politicians who are focused on maintaining power rather than on using power for something meaningful. We see politicians who hide behind ideology or principle while practical problems go unsolved. We see politicians who refuse to act during crises, insisting that market forces or natural processes will eventually solve the problem. Van Buren's failure is a warning to these contemporary politicians. Because if they don't learn from his mistake, they are doomed to repeat it. If they continue to prioritize political machinery over vision, if they continue to choose pragmatism over principle, if they continue to refuse to act during crises, then they will suffer the same failures that Van Buren suffered. They will find themselves in positions of power during times of crisis, and they will discover that all their political skill is useless if they don't know what to do with power. The lesson is clear. Political skill is necessary, but not sufficient for leadership. You need more than the ability to win elections. You need vision. You need moral clarity. You need the courage to take risks. You need the willingness to act boldly when circumstances demand it. You need to understand that power is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. The end should be something greater than simply maintaining your own power. After Van Buren's death on July 24, 1862, his family preserved his estate at Lindenwold. They kept his library. They kept his personal papers. They kept his home essentially as it had been. They ensured that future generations would be able to see where Van Buren had lived and understand something of who he had been. Today, more than 160 years after his death, Lindenwold stands as a museum maintained by the National Park Service. Visitors from all over America and all over the world come to see where Van Buren lived. They walk through his rooms. They see his library with its hundreds of books. They learn about his life and his times. They try to understand who Martin Van Buren was and what he accomplished. These visitors come to Lindenwold asking the same questions that historians have asked for generations. Who was Van Buren? What did he accomplish? Why did he fail? What can we learn from his life? The rooms at Lindenwold provide no easy answers to these questions, but they provide context. They provide the setting in which Van Buren lived and worked. They help visitors understand that Van Buren was not an abstract historical figure, but a real human being who lived and worked and thought in real places. Van Buren's papers are preserved in archives. His books are still read. His life continues to be studied and discussed by historians and scholars. In a real sense, Van Buren continues to speak to us across the centuries. His life raises questions that are still relevant. His failures teach lessons that are still applicable. His example continues to provoke thought and reflection about the nature of power, the importance of leadership, and the meaning of success and failure. Every generation rediscovers Van Buren and finds in his life different lessons relevant to their own time. In the age of industrial capitalism, historians saw Van Buren as a figure of organizational genius who pioneered modern political techniques. In the age of the New Deal, historians saw Van Buren as a cautionary example of what happens when government refuses to act during a crisis. In our contemporary age, historians see Van Buren as an example of what happens when political skill is not accompanied by moral clarity and vision. Van Buren's life is like a mirror that reflects different truths depending on the angle from which you look at it. And this is part of what makes him an enduring historical figure. Not because he was great, but because his life was so richly complex that every generation can find something to learn from it. And so we return to the question with which we began. Who was Martin Van Buren? What did his life mean? What legacy did he leave behind? The answer is complex and multifaceted. He was a man, a complicated man, a talented man, a limited man, a man who achieved great things and who failed at important tasks. A man who rose from poverty to power and then saw that power slip through his fingers. A man who lived a long life and spent much of that life wondering if his life had mattered. A man who built institutions that would outlast him by centuries, even though most people would forget his name. Martin Van Buren's life did matter. Not in the way he hoped it would matter. Not in the way he expected it to matter. But it mattered nonetheless. He shaped the institutions through which American politics operates. He demonstrated that ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things. He showed what happens when political skill is not accompanied by vision or moral clarity. He left a legacy that endures even though his name is forgotten. In the end, that may be the most important thing about Martin Van Buren, that he left something behind that continues to influence the world, even though most people don't know his name. He created something that will outlast his fame. He accomplished something that will outlast his life. He built institutions that would continue to matter for generations after he was gone. And perhaps that is the closest any of us can come to true immortality, to create something that continues to matter even after we are gone. To build something that influences the world in ways we can never fully comprehend. The most haunting question about Van Buren's life is simply this: what if? What if Van Buren had responded boldly to the Panic of 1837? What if he had proposed government relief programs? What if he had used the power of the federal government to try to help people suffering from the Depression? He might have failed anyway. The Depression was severe and might have been beyond the power of government to prevent or mitigate. But he would have tried, and if he had tried, he would be remembered differently. He would be remembered as a leader who faced a crisis and acted, even if his actions didn't succeed. What if Van Buren had taken a clear anti-slavery stance from the beginning of his political career? What if he had refused to compromise with slavery? What if he had used his political genius not to build the Democratic Party as a coalition that included slavery, but to build a political force dedicated to stopping slavery? History might have been very different. American politics might have developed differently. The path to the Civil War might have been different. The moral clarity that Van Buren finally achieved in his old age might have been achieved when he was young and had power to act on it. But Van Buren didn't make those choices. He chose compromise. He chose caution. He chose pragmatism. And because of these choices, he is remembered as a failure instead of as a success. The story of Martin Van Buren is ultimately a story about choices. About the choices we make and the consequences that follow from those choices. About the paths we take and the paths we don't take. About the dreams we pursue and the dreams we abandon. About the visions we build and the visions we ignore. About the principles we stand for and the principles we compromise away. About the lives we lead and the lives we might have led. Van Buren was a man who made choices. Some of those choices were wise, some were foolish. Some led to great accomplishments. Some led to failure. Some choices built institutions that would last for centuries. Some choices robbed him of the legacy he might have had. In the end, Van Buren's life teaches us that we are the sum of our choices. That our lives are not determined by the circumstances we're born into or the opportunities that come to us, but by the choices we make when we encounter those circumstances and opportunities. That we cannot escape responsibility for our choices by blaming external forces or claiming that we had no alternative. That we must live with the consequences of our choices, whether they turn out well or poorly. But he also lived long enough to see that you can't undo your choices. You can't reclaim the years you spent on the wrong path. You can't recover the opportunities you missed. You can live differently in your later years, but that doesn't erase what came before. This is perhaps the deepest lesson that Van Buren's life teaches us. That our choices matter profoundly. That we should choose carefully. That we should think about the long-term consequences of our actions. That we should not sacrifice principle for pragmatism. That we should not pursue power without knowing what we intend to do with it. And perhaps most importantly, that we should act boldly when circumstances demand it. that we should have the courage to risk failure for the possibility of success, that we should be willing to use whatever power we have to help those who are suffering, that we should never hide behind principle or ideology while real people face real hardship. These are the lessons of Martin van Buren. These are the truths that his life teaches us. And these are the reasons why his story is still worth telling, still worth studying, still worth reflecting upon. Even more than 160 years after his death, Martin van Buren died. The world continued. Time moved forward. But the world that Van Buren had helped create continued on, and it continues on still. In this way, Van Buren achieved a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of fame, not the immortality of being remembered in popular culture or in the minds of ordinary people, but the immortality of having shaped the institutions through which millions of people live their lives, of having influenced the course of human events, of having left a mark on history that would endure long after his name had faded from memory.